In this video, I'm going to review the issue of clay safety at home because you're working with clay at home and it's a fun material. There's so many cool things you can do with clay. I find it super engaging. I love that it's hands-on and it really makes you think differently than if you're drawing and painting. But at the same time, you need to learn how to protect yourself. So this slideshow and the Edpuzzle is going to review important information that you need to know about as we start working with clay. This is very, very important. You definitely want to follow proper safety and cleanup procedures. Yes, you're going to be cleaning up at home on your own. In the classroom, I establish certain procedures and rules for cleanup. So I have less to clean up, so you have less to clean up. And we really don't want clay getting into things that you eat from. We don't want clay getting on your carpet, on your bed. We definitely don't want clay in reach of pets or siblings, right? You might have siblings, younger siblings especially, that might want to play with it, but they don't realize that like it's not meant to be eaten. And these are all guidelines, but ultimately it's up to you because I'm not there with you at home. I can only advise you on what to do. So something to keep in mind is clay contains silica, and you actually learned that at the beginning of this unit. Silica is a colorless compound. It kind of looks like that in the photo. It looks like a pile of dust, and it's an important ingredient in clay and glazes. It helps create the structure for clay and glaze. So it's an essential part in ceramic clay. But when clay dries out, the silica, the clay turns to dust, and that dust contains silica. And it looks like dust, but it's not. It's actually lighter than air. So it floats around in the air for a long time and can be inhaled by you, by anybody who's living with you. And it's basically powdered glass. And if you're inhaling in it continuously over time, many, many years, it can actually cause permanent lung damage, including cancer or silicosis. Later on, if you want to watch this video about silica exposure, you are going to have access to this slideshow later on. But how does it get into your lungs? Well, if you have dried clay on your hands, when you move your hands, the dry clay breaks loose and it gets into the air. I mean, that's just a natural occurrence, and there are things you can do to deter that. If you're touching or working on bone dry clay, I will emphasize many times, your clay should not be drying out to bone dry clay because we're not going to be firing your projects at home. I'm going to be firing your projects at school. So the work should be bone dry at school, not at home. Clay crumbs, any scraps that drop onto the floor, they get stepped on, they dry out, and then when you step on them, they turn to dust, and that dust gets kicked up into the air. And that's the same thing that happens in the classroom as well. If you have dried clay on your clay tools, if you're brushing off your clothing that had wet clay on it and then it dries, so basically anything that's causing the clay to become disrupted and then, it's dusty and then you're breathing it in by accident. If you're washing a dirty table, but you're not actually drying it out. So how do you protect your lungs? You definitely want to rinse your hands if they get coated with dry clay. I like to have a bucket of water near me so I can just easily rinse them off. I'm not washing them thoroughly, just rinsing them. You never want to brush or clap your hands to get the dry clay off. That's a big no-no. I've seen students do it in class and I'm immediately telling them, hey, don't do that. You're creating dust that you can breathe in and your friends are breathing in. You shouldn't be having any finished pieces at home that are like drying out. You definitely want to keep everything in a bag. I would keep everything wrapped in plastic, whether it's your plastic bags or plastic wrap. Even when you're bringing them in for a firing, work only with wet or leather hard clay because wet or leather hard clay still has moisture. It's not creating dust because the clay is still kind of moist. If you have things falling onto the floor, check your floor. Do you have clay crumbs, right? Again, if you have a carpet, it's going to be a little bit more tricky. So you have to be very mindful of where your clay is when you're working. You definitely want to clean your tools thoroughly and put them away properly. I will be demonstrating and showing you how to take care of all your supplies. Drying the table off with a clean towel after wiping it with a wet sponge. The wet sponge ensures that everything's being cleaned properly, like the wet sponge absorbs the dry dust. If you're using a cloth to work on, shake that cloth off outside, away from an open doorway. You might even need to rinse it. At school, we gently shake off our canvas cloths outside over a trash can. If you're using any electronics, your Chromebook, your phone, AirPods, camera, anything that you're using, you have to assume clay dust can get into them. So you want to make sure they're placed away from your general area of working, or if you need to use one of those electronics when you're working, make sure you have an area to rinse off your hands and clean them off so you're not accidentally getting clay dust on them or in them. So what does this all mean? Clay dust is hazardous to your health and others if you're exposed for long periods of time. Now, the amount of time that you'll be working with clay, believe me, it's not going to hurt you. But again, I warn students because you want to work smart when you work with the clay. So you want to keep your area clean and organized. You want to keep clay scraps off the floor. You always want to clean up with a wet sponge and water. Do not ever sweep or blow the dust around. So, what does a safe studio setting look like? Essentially, at home, you're creating a studio setting. It's an art studio. So, don't eat the clay. You definitely not want to work with clay in areas like your kitchen or areas where you're going to be eating, prepping food. You really want to have an area away from that because you don't want clay dust ending up in your food. Again, it's not healthy to inhale. You want to protect your work table. So I like to work on a piece of canvas. You can use an old sheet or pillowcase, a large plastic bag. There's a couple solutions that you can use to work right on the table. Protect any soft surfaces. Now, I don't do this at home because I work with clay in the garage, which is a little bit different because it's not really a living space. It's just an area that stores things. But I am very mindful of the clay that I am using in that space. You want to keep your clay and tools out of the reach of small children and pets. If they accidentally eat it, oh, that's not good. You want to find a safe space to store your clay, your tools, and in progress projects. You don't want something getting knocked over. So my suggestion is to get maybe a plastic bin, keep everything in there, keep it in a safe place, maybe away from your bed, just somewhere safe. Never ever put clay down the sink. It will clog your drain, your pipes over time. So you want to use a bucket, some sort of container of water for rinsing your hands and tools. You don't need to dump out the water every time because clay actually sinks overnight. You just want to dump out the water later on outside. I will show you how to do that when you learn how to clean up in ceramics. But you don't want to put clay down the toilet, down the kitchen sink, down the bathroom sink. You always want to wear some sort of apron or an old shirt when working with clay. This helps prevent dust ending up on your clothes. If you do get clay on your clothes, it's not the end of the world. Just wipe it off with a damp, clean towel. Avoid using brooms. So if you're working in a space that is regularly swept with a broom, you don't want clay getting on the floor because if that clay is dried out and it's dust, when your broom sweeps it, right? You don't want the dust flying around in the air and you end up breathing it in. The clay tools, whether it's the ones that I will give you eventually or it's the ceramic tools that you're making on your own with the materials, only use them for clay. If you decide to use a metal fork or something plastic for creating textures, you want to wash them well before you use them for anything else. Anything wooden, you do not want to reuse that for food. You never ever want to let your clay dry out. There's no reason at all for your clay to dry to bone dry because you're not firing it at home. So always keep it sealed in a plastic bag. As I said, you're going to need to get many plastic bags. You can occasionally spray it with water to keep it moist. As I've said, avoid creating more clay dust than necessary. If you're carving, if you're scraping the clay, make sure you're only doing that with plastic and leather hard clay. You shouldn't be doing this with bone dry clay because if you're carving the clay and it's already bone dry, one, it could potentially break apart. Two, you're making a lot of dust that you can actually inhale. Not good for you. Don't eat or drink while working with the clay. Put your food aside, put your things aside. In the classroom, I don't let students eat or drink in the classroom, especially when we're working on art. So how do you keep yourself happy? Happy? How do you keep yourself healthy? Oh, that was a good boo-boo. So if you have any open wounds on your hands, make sure you cover it up with a Band-Aid. In class, I have a boatload of Band-Aids that students can use for that purpose. Clay will dry out your skin, so make sure you use some sort of skin lotion, hand lotion after each studio session. In school, I have a bottle of lotion always available for students to use. Again, avoid creating clay dust or allowing it to build up. So you definitely want to take care and clean up your workspace after every single session. Create some sort of cleanup routine. And if you're having a hard time just trying to figure out distance learning at home, this is definitely going to be a challenge for you. You want to keep your workspace safe to work and live in. You can totally do clay at home. You can keep it safe. You just have to work smart. And something to remember is when your clay is wet, it's safe because it's not creating any dust.